The next element we're going to look at is value. In order to add dimension and depth to your designs, you'll need to understand the principles of value and color. Value is intrinsic in all designs. A successful design generally needs to work well in black and white. Color shouldn't be used as a crutch to prop up an otherwise poor design. Value, like contrast, is inherent in any design as soon as any kind of image is placed on the format. It could be considered an automatic ingredient. What is value anyways? Well, it can be simply defined as the relative lightness or darkness of an object. Let's examine how value works in everyday life and then apply those same principles to value in design. If you think of animals and insects that utilize value as a defense mechanism, by assuming colors in shades that are similar to their environment, they protect themselves against predators. Think about fireworks. Will fireworks work in the day, visually? You may see the smoke and hear the boom, but the effect and the beauty of the color is lost. The night sky is what provides the background to the and creates the right value to contrast with the fireworks. You need the black night sky or the dark night sky in order to see the value. Effective use of value allows the user to see the design elements at their full potential. Value is one of the most important and least understood concepts in design. Value is not color. Value is also not contrast, which is a separate principle of design. Contrast can be found in any element: texture, shape, size and scale, space, color, line, or value, which is why it's a principle, not an element. Value is the tone of a color. It has more to do with the dark and light than the red or the blue. The visual spectrum of value ranges from black to white. It can dramatically alter the mood of a design depending on the amount of contrast that is present. Value gives shape and texture to everything around us. Although colors have value, like a dark red shirt and a light red sweater, it's often easier to visualize values in terms of black and white. If you take a black and white photo of a street, shadowed areas will appear black and light-colored houses will appear white, and other areas will be shades of gray between those two extremes. The way a tree trunk is shaded with grays from the lightest to the darkest parts tells us that they are round. Also, the dark and light patterns created by the uneven surface of the trunk tell us that it has texture. All elements have value. Any element added to a format automatically brings value with it. Since every element you deal with contains a degree of value, anywhere from 1% to 100% black, assuming that you have a white or gray background, or if you have a background that is black, any element added will be between 1% and 100% white. This fact implies another quality, that value is actually relative. Because value is relative, any element's value can be affected by its background and other elements around it. Setting lots of type in a small area of white paper will make the paper look as if it's turned gray. The value of something is relative to the other elements that are near it and to the background that it's placed on. The greater the difference in value between the object and its background, the greater the contrast. It is possible to achieve contrast without value. You could use texture or varying shapes, but you can't have value without contrast. Value is an important tool for expressing your theme. Value is important because it contributes to the unity and to the mood of the design. You can use slight variations from light to dark, which are low contrast value, to create a calm, quiet mood. Soft, grainy photos set against a pastel background create such a mood. Or you could use a great variation from light to dark, which is high contrast value, and this is going to convey a feeling of drama or excitement. A yellow and black striped background could communicate excitement. The strongest contrast available in art is black and white. Strong contrast is useful for controlling attention. Colors can contrast, but hue and saturation differences are weaker than value contrasts. With or without color, the designer must be aware of the value structure of a composition. The visibility, and hence the readability of an image, depends mostly on the careful use of value. Since value is such a powerful influence on the feel and the mood of the design, your goal should be to learn how to use value intentionally to create the strongest possible design. The skillful use of value in your designs will add power and appropriateness. There is no way to say that this is the correct value. What matters is the desired effect. Value can be used to create a mood. Values can be used to establish contrast, or the opposite, a subtle blending of shades. What difference in moods are created when the values create a strong contrast? Well, the more stark the element is against the background, the bolder the statement. On the other hand, a softness is created in either high key, which is light tones, or low key, dark tones, by using subtlety in value and minimal contrast. In the examples to the right, notice the difference in the impressions created by just a single element that's placed in the format in 3 varying shades. And you can see here's full value black, and here are some varying degree of black, which is basically gray. And you can see if you just look at these one by one, different moods are created by the amount of value by this simple circle that is placed in the rectangle. No other principle of structure has more power to create mood than value. With effective use of black and white and gray values, you can add power to change the mood of a design. Value can also create movement and direction. A black dot placed on a white format creates a sharp contrast, but the design is very static. When a second dot of equal value is added, the 2 elements share equal importance, but the format still remains static. Finally, when a second dot of different value is added, you begin to see movement and direction created through the use of value. When a format is flooded with elements of equal value, they will share equal prominence. This can create a static feeling of sameness, which is being shown here. When elements in the format are of a different value, then you begin to create movement through value. And when you place dots in a specific order, their value is going to lead the eye in a certain direction, just as you can lead the eye using shapes and other elements by placing them in a pattern. Notice how the design is given movement and direction when the dots are placed in a pattern according to value. The eye tends to go to the first shapes that have the most contrast. So you're going to want to start down here and then come up. And you'll end here too because it repeats. To be successful as a designer, it's necessary to be able to use value effectively. Value provides the maximum contrast available and is useful for controlling visibility and hence controlling attention. If you look at the example to the right and ask yourself which bars stand out the strongest against their surroundings. Well, the first, the dark bar, is clearly visible against the white background, but it's barely visible against the black. And then the second bar, which is the lightest bar, its contrasts are opposite. It's barely visible up here against the white, but it's very visible against the black. The third gray bar is equally visible against both black and white, but not as visible as the high contrast areas of the first 2 bars. The fourth bar, which is a black to white gradient, has maximum contrast at either end, since the ending points of the gradients are at complete opposite value of what they sit on. Then the colored bars add hue and saturation as considerations. The red bar right here is a middle value, and it contrasts equally with black and white. The brightness of the red is going to make it more visible. The violet bar corresponds to the first dark gray bar in contrast. It's kind of similar to this bar as far as the value of it. But it has high contrast against the white, but more of a low contrast against the black. And then the 2 yellow bars correspond with the second light gray bar, this one right here, in contrast. The brighter yellow does make the bar more visible, against the white and the black, but the contrast is still low and it cannot be depended on to be very noticeable. Against the black, it has a very strong value contrast and a strong color appeal as well. So it's kind of interesting to look at this in this manner. If we look at the next example that I've made, I want you to ask yourself which bars stand out the strongest against their surroundings. Actually, my mouse shouldn't have been over there. I let the surprise go. Let's take a look though. Both the black and white bars have equal contrast against the bright middle value colors. So this green and red, even though they're very different colors, when I mouse over, I've just simply changed this to a grayscale image. You can see that the value of the green and the red is exactly the same. So even though the color themselves is very, very different, the value is exactly the same. So when we look at the other colors that are sitting on top of this form, you can see that the black and white, they have equal contrast against both colors. The middle value gray, it has little contrast, and where it is visible, but it's not very noticeable. And you can see when we mouse over, it's kind of similar to the darker gray that basically is the equivalent value of that green and red background that it's sitting on. The red bar, it's very visible against the green, but it disappears against the red background. And then the light red and dark bars are easily visible against both backgrounds. And the green bars basically have the same contrast relationship. They're visible against the different hue, but more visible against both backgrounds when there is also a value difference. So this last green bar, you can see it against both the green and the red, but this second to last green bar, you can't see it at all against the green because it has the same value. Kind of interesting to do that. It's easy to overestimate the visibility of same or similar value colors. When the shapes are simple and large, like the bars that sit on the red and green, the contrast seems adequate, but as soon as I turn this into a grayscale value, you can see that really the green and the red bar don't really have enough contrast since they have the exact same value. When images are more complex and demanding, the situation changes somewhat, but you need to be aware of this so you know what happens to value. And a good way to actually see value working is to just take your image and convert it into a grayscale image and see what happens to the colors. Okay, now just excuse the color combination. I'm doing this to make a point, but I want you to take a look and see how readable these words truly are. Notice that you can see each of the words, but because of the value, certain words are easier to read. So how readable are the most? They're the easiest to read. Our each is readable, but it definitely is weak because the value is the same. And this is the same red and green combination that was used in the last exercise. So if we were to turn this into a grayscale image, our each would not be able to be seen at all. And then of these words are just lighter and darker values of the green and the red. And they are, they contrast with the background okay, but definitely the black and the white are the things that you can read the best. In order to use values effectively, what you're going to want to think about, there's two major considerations when using value: the amount of contrast and the tonal range of the values used. The first controls visibility and the second mood and ambiance. So contrast, when you think about contrast, the visibility and hence the noticeability of an item depends largely on how much contrast it makes with its surroundings. Black and white, of course, are the extremes of value. The most different items can be from each other. When the extreme is used, the contrast makes the item the most visible. When the contrast is lessened, the visibility is reduced so that the minimum contrast produced, it produces minimum visibility. And you can see that being shown here. Most visible is the black. The gray becomes a little less visible, and then the very light gray is the least visible. So skillful use of this particular concept is going to allow you as a designer to control visibility and therefore also have more attention to emphasis. Let's talk a little bit about tonal range. The range of values from black to white is the tonal range available to the designer or the artist. The ability to use that range effectively lets the designer determine the mood of an image and create and control ambience. The photographer Ansel Adams is a master at using tone effectively. He says that a photographer should make a picture, not just take a picture. He visualizes what he wants the image to look like, what he wants to communicate, before he actually makes the picture. Then he sets up his equipment and he gets the images that he wants. And that's how you should be thinking of things as a designer. You shouldn't just stumble upon something and hope that it happens, but you should actually visualize what you want it to look like first. What is it that you want to communicate? What do you want to say? Then make it happen. Ansel Adams uses the complete tonal range at his disposal. His images always include deep, rich blacks. He usually uses the full range of white, and even in a dark image, unless he's trying to indicate some sort of misty day, he always uses full black and full white. And you can see that in this beautiful picture taken up at Yosemite. The effect of black areas in an image that includes whites gives the feeling that the blacks are somehow blacker than if most of the image were black and no areas were very light at all. The reason is that the tonal range of the image provides the necessary contrast that allows you to see what the artist wants you to see. And the same is true of whites. When less than the entire tonal range is used in the image, it can look flat, and it's harder to generate interest that way. Similarly, a predominantly light image will seem lighter and more positive than a predominantly dark image. The tonal range helps set the mood. So please think about this as you create your designs. You'll definitely see an improvement. By using value, you can visually separate different kinds of copy. If you use large type and heavy leading for body copy, that's going to be a lighter value than tightly packed smaller type for sidebars. That will maybe create a darker value on the page with just text. You can lead the eye across the page. If you run a dark to light graded tone or tint in the background, that's something that you can play around with value. With value, you can create a pattern such as some sort of checkerboard effect. You could give the illusion of volume and depth. If you shade a shape to make it look three-dimensional, you're going to give it the illusion of volume or depth. You could give a piece an understated subtle feeling by using only light values. You could make a layout more dramatic. Use areas of black against areas of stark white. You could emphasize an element. Make the most important element very light and all the others very dark, or vice versa. You could make objects appear to be in front of or in back of each other. Dark areas always recede in space. What to consider when using value? You want to think, have you really chosen the value present in your design? Or have you allowed values to present themselves as they will, without careful use and manipulation where necessary? Have you intentionally chosen values that provide contrast? Is the contrast appropriate to the idea of your design? Have you intentionally chosen values that are very similar to provide subtle or blended effects? Is this appropriate to the idea of your design? Does value help move the eye through your design? Keep in mind that the eye tends to go first to the shapes that have the most contrast. And finally, what mood is created by the values you have chosen? So think about these when you're considering value to use in a piece. Let's go ahead and deconstruct a couple of ads and talk about how value is being used. The first example I have is from the Surfrider Foundation, and it has very low contrast. Sometimes that can be boring, but it can also be indicative of harmony or balance of the subjects. In this particular Surfrider ad, it doesn't have a lot of contrast in value, there are no deep shadows or very dark colors, but it does create a very innocent atmosphere by just having a low contrast, low value ad. This is the focal point of the ad, to create the innocence of childhood and something that should be so pure, the beach. However, the darker part of the message lurks beneath the surface. If you look closely at the child, he's actually holding an old plastic bottle to his ear, not a shell, and the tagline reads, "Don't let pollution take over." So if you take a look at the Surfrider logo, it too has a very light and airy presence on the page, because although it is dark, it is not visually heavy, it's not thick. Value has not only to do with the actual dark or lightness, but it can also be reflected in the visual weight of an element on the layout. The next example is a Colgate ad, and we see the use of value right here. You can see that there is very subtle value, and basically there is not a lot of you know what, I just said Colgate ad, but this is actually the Snickers ad. I'm sorry. The Snickers ad, the value is, it's very obvious. It's in the color. It's a very monochromatic ad. It just uses a few subtle shades of blue, giving us an almost uniform value throughout the whole piece. Value is relative to the element around it. Where value is going to contrast is in the weight and density of the artwork that is on the page. So when you start to look closely, you can see that some areas have more space around them than others, and that creates more white space, and it's creating contrast in value on its own. So even though the line stroke is pretty uniform throughout, it appears to have a different value due to the white space that is used between the line drawings. The density differs and we end up with contrast. It's interesting to see how something like this is able to achieve contrast and a difference in the overall value of the piece, which is the density is going to provide the value in this particular piece. So even though this is very monochromatic and has a lot of sameness, the amount value is still seen here. It's subtle, but it's definitely still seen. The next example is the Unicef polluted water ad, and this exemplifies using value to emphasize. The darker areas towards the bottom and the edges, they really frame the center of the layout and they push your eye towards the middle of the layout. Even with this monochromatic coloring, the ad still stands out because of the diversity in value. There's such a dynamic range of value in this poster, and the designer did an excellent job of using value to create a mood. The high contrast in value is very dramatic. It's eerie, it's intriguing and fresh all at the same time. The logo and the tagline use minimal contrast in value, but because of the simplicity of the ad and the powerful main element, it's still easy to read and to understand. And the final example is the Colgate example, and you can see in the Colgate ad we see the use of value on the strawberry. The strawberry is basically the focal point in the ad, and there's a very subtle value contrast from the lit side on the left to the shadowed side over here on the right, and as well as just the element sitting on a very stark white background. Your eye easily goes from the top down to the logo, so you're drawn of course first to the strawberry and then you just bop right down here to the little product shot and logo. The only elements in the form, these are the only elements in the whole format, and they successfully grasp your attention and lead your eye throughout the piece. The value changes in the strawberry are kept very gradual and very subtle. So hopefully this gave you some ideas of how value is being used in real life examples, and you'll be more aware of value in your own designs.